Hey there guys, I'm Will and welcome to the first episode of the FP1 Fan Podcast. So this of course is the podcast where you guys as the viewers can get involved and can come on the show. Got a really exciting special guest as well, which we're going to introduce in just a second. But yeah, if you do want to get involved, then hit me up in my DMs on Twitter at Will2000. I'll pop a link for that in the description below. And yeah, we can talk about basically whatever you want to. But as I said, my first guest on the podcast is a fellow F1 YouTuber and a long-time friend of the show as well. I've got Ollie from TGSF1. Ollie, how are you? How's your quarantine been so far?
I'm very good, thank you, mate, and thank you for having me. It's been interesting. I think one of the good things has been a little bit more time to do F1 YouTube and do F1 content, but obviously because there's no racing, there's limited scope on what we can talk about. So it's been interesting. It was tough to start with, but it feels like we're seeing a bit of light at the end of the tunnel. So I'm excited for us to go racing and also to just leave the house, to be honest.
Yeah, I can feel you on that one, definitely. And obviously Austria not too long away now. Start of July, is it? Or start of June? I can't remember now. Start of July.
Start of July, yeah.
Start of July. So we haven't got long to wait. We're getting there. We're just off a month. But yeah, we're here to talk about Renault, possibly one of the biggest question marks on the grid at the moment, not just for their driver lab, but for their place in the sport on a whole. Now, we've got the 2022 race coming in, and that obviously they've now agreed a cost cap as well, but is that going to save them from the sport? What are your opinions on Renault's future as a whole beyond 2021?
Yeah, it's a really interesting time for them, I think, as a team. I think you can go back a few years really to Red Bull deciding that they were going to go with a different engine, which caused a bit of a chain effect with, McLaren also then deciding that wasn't the engine that they wanted either, and reverting back to a bit of a longer standing partnership they had in the past with Mercedes. And I think one of the things that was quite interesting when that happened is they managed to poach Ricciardo, which still to this day makes no sense to me, and it's already been announced that he's not going to be there anymore after this season anyway. And I think that for Cyril particularly, was a bit of a marquee signing in the fact that they wanted to show that they'd still got some strength, if you like, in their F1 operation and as a brand and as a racing outfit. But, if you look at it now, in hindsight, it's very easy to point to that and say, could that have been a bit of a mistake? And obviously they've been losing that revenue that they were generating from, providing those parts to other teams. And then with COVID-19 happening, I think everything, not just for Renault, but for a lot of the grid was thrown up in the air. And Renault in particular, they're state-backed to an extent. They're a very, very strong part of French culture and tied very much to the French people. And for them to leave the sport would be quite disastrous. They've been in since, the 70s or 80s, I think, in the capacity that they are now. And I think they would have been in a lot more trouble if, as you hadn't just mentioned, those cost caps had been agreed. And me personally, I'm a big fan of the idea of the cost cap and of levelling the field for the midfield teams and the bigger teams too. And when it was first proposed, there was a lot of pushback from probably the bigger teams and the richer teams, as you can imagine. But for someone like Renault and for some other teams like McLaren and even Racing Point, or soon to be Aston Martin, I think that cost cap has been a bit of a lifeline for all of them. And the fact that it's been, I think, was it last week or maybe the week before, it got reduced even further with all the COVID-19 situation that's happening. It is still bloody expensive. We're still talking, hundreds of millions of pounds that these teams are going to be spending. But for someone like Renault, that is much more manageable than, having to throw all the money in the world at chasing those top three teams. And that's where they want to be ultimately. Every team says they want to be near the top, but a brand and a manufacturer like Renault, they really do want and potentially could be at the top with the amount of money that they have available to them. And so I think that cost cap has been a big lifeline for them. And I think Cyril was chatting to Autosport the other day and has clearly said that, with that limitation to the spending from other teams, outside of the driver and marketing situation, it is becoming a little bit more financially viable for people to commit long term. So, yeah, I think that's going to have a big impact. It would have been absolutely terrible if they had decided to leave, but I think that is going to be the lifeline for them. And they mentioned as well they finally got a new CEO coming in. They'd had an interim CEO running things for the last few months, but I think it's Luca Maio. I don't have a clue how his name is pronounced, but he's being confirmed, I think just after the first race weekend, midway through July, as the sort of permanent CEO. And despite the fact that there's going to be obvious cost cutting at Renault, and in fact, as we're speaking now, I think just about 20 minutes ago, McLaren announced that they were going to have to axe a load of jobs across their group. There is going to be cost cutting to come in the next year too, before we get out of what is inevitably going to be a difficult recession for everyone. But I do see them still being here in the next few years, which I think is good for everyone. So yeah, probably waffled on a little bit too long there, but I'd say my initial reaction, I think they should be floating around and hopefully progressing, because it's good to have people like Renault competing and being competitive and not just making up the numbers, which is obviously not where they want to be.
Exactly, and they're a factory team, and we haven't got many of those left. You want to go back to the early 2000s, and in fact even back towards 2010 when we had that last recession. You had BMW, you had Renault, you had obviously Ferrari, McLaren still there, Toyota in the sport, Honda, all these manufacturers that, although some of them have come back now, but a lot of them have left. And I guess that's where a lot of the worries have come from as well. Go back to the 2008 recession, and we saw a lot of teams leave the sport, Renault being one of them at the end of the 2010 or 2011 seasons, whenever you want to put it. That kind of merger with Lotus kind of took a couple of years. But there is that worry there. And you're right in saying the cost cap could bring them back. I think the cost cap for me isn't going to be the only thing that Renault need to have to stay in the sport. It's going to be their competitiveness as well, and also, if they're not getting those podiums that they wanted, they're going to have a look at the sport and think, okay, what are we actually doing here? At the moment, they've kind of put themselves as a bit of a laughing stock. They've just lost their star driver. Go back a few months, they were disqualified from a Grand Prix for having an illegal system in their car. It's not the best for that company PR-wise. And, if these things will keep adding up on top of each other, and again, some of Cyril's decisions in the last few years or months haven't really been the best either. And again, we'll go back to when Ricciardo left, and he put that statement out. I can't remember exactly what he said, but it just came off incredibly childish to a lot of people, talking about how commitment and all this was necessary in the Formula One team. And, he did sound a little bit butthurt. You've got to put it that way. And he's not going to leave that team anytime soon. He's got his wife's on the board, so there's no chance he's going to get fired. I just worry that he could end up bringing that team down, and I'm afraid that the guys up top are basically come in and say, we're not getting out of Formula One what we wanted, and as a car brand we want to stay afloat, and with, as you said, the COVID-19 situation, one of the first things that's going to be cut is going to be that Formula One program. So yeah, it's a bit of a worry. I guess that kind of leads to my next question for you. In terms of the competitive nature of Renault, either this year, we've obviously seen them come with a completely new design philosophy this year, especially at the front end of the car. Could we see them make a step up before 2022 or after 2022? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. I think, everyone always tells me don't read too much into testing. You never know anything when it comes to testing, who's somebody and what programs they're running. And I think you're right. I think they're right, that you can't read too much into it. But like you said, we did see a different design philosophy there. They've gone with that sort of narrow nose, and the car looked aesthetically quite interesting as a piece of kit. But they did seem to do a decent amount of runs at testing, and they do have to get better. Like you said, I don't think they can carry on treading water. If you're not moving forwards in Formula One, you're going backwards, because all the teams around you, marginal gains is such a buzzword, but it is, especially in that midfield battle on a race weekend or on qualifying, you're looking at tenths of seconds, half tenths of seconds that make the difference between 4 or 5 grid places sometimes. So they're going to have to be better than last year. I honestly don't have an opinion yet on whether they have made that change or not. I think one of the interesting things for them is they do have the talent there if they've given them the car to do things that perhaps they wouldn't necessarily expect. So Daniel Ricciardo coming in last year, you're looking at, a Grand Prix winner. I think, I can't remember, 8 or 9 wins to his name, Daniel, proven that he can do it if you give him the machinery. And sometimes he even outperformed what that Red Bull could do in certain circumstances. And I think if you give him and Esteban Ocon a car that is, marginally better than it was last year, they're going to have the opportunity to do things. I think a good sort of benchmark for that would be someone like Carlos Sainz, what he did last year in that McLaren. Clearly that was a good race car, but when you compare what he did to Norris, fair enough, Norris was a rookie, but you can see him getting more out of that car than perhaps you would expect. And I think for Renault to move forward, it's probably going to have to be something like that. That, Daniel does a few really good races. Esteban shows that he's really got the pace in that car. So I think impossible to tell yet till we go racing. But I agree with you. If you want to be as successful, or you want to promote your car brand as successful through the marketing platform that is Formula One, they basically have to. They've just got to get better. But it's an interesting point that you make, obviously, looking towards those regulations which have now been pushed back, is how much does someone like Renault balance, a short-term versus long-term outlook in the next couple of years? Because if they're not doing great this season and they're not doing great next year under the current regs, do you just turn your attention straight away to, right, what can we do with this new, with these new system of regulations that are going to come in 2022? And do they, I don't want to say write off a year, because you can't really afford to write off a year when you're trying to get all that prize money. But, someone like Renault as a manufacturer, could it be, or could it potentially be more beneficial for them to maybe just look ahead to 2022 and say, right, this is where we're going to start getting back to where we really want to be? Is it worth them putting so much resource into upgrades on the car this year, when, as we've mentioned, everyone's already got the bootstraps down when it comes to how much money they're going to spend? So it's going to be an interesting one to see. I think I quite like that driver combination that they've got this year. So I think that, a small amount of increase in terms of the performance of the car will translate to potentially, exponentially better performance on the track. As it relates to, McLaren and Racing Point and all those others that they're going to be competing themselves or putting themselves against this year.
But just before we move on to drivers as well, because that's going to be an interesting point looking at 2021 onwards, you were talking about, if you're not moving forward, then you're falling back in Formula One. You've got Racing Point or Tracing Point, however you want to put it, with that effective 2019 Mercedes, and that's going to be quick. I genuinely think that's going to be quick at the start of next year, or this year even. And then you've got McLaren as well, who, if they won't be faster than Renault this year with that Mercedes engine and the aerodynamic package they've got in the car, again, it's going to chuck Renault back 2 spots. So rather than fighting for 4th, you're now looking at P6. And the I don't know off the top of my head what the difference in prize money is for those two, but it's millions and millions of pounds. And that's going to hurt a team if they haven't got that. And again, talking about the 2022 regs, we've seen in the past, I want to take back to Honda back in 2008. They effectively wrote off the 2008 season to focus on their 2009 car and the double diffuser, but then we got hit by the global recession, and Honda had to pull out. Now, obviously, luckily in that case, Braun was able to pick up the pieces, and they had that incredible season in 2009, but it's not really the best of times to, as you say, chuck away a year, because the teams can't afford to do that. They need the money to just stay in the sport in the first place. And if Renault, let's say they chuck away a year and they end up P6 or P7 fighting with the Alphas or the Alpha Tauris, it's going to hurt their brand quite a lot, because people look and say, well, 2 years ago they were fighting for 4th, and now they're laundering back at the rear end of the midfield. It's a really difficult balance as to when they need to switch their focus to 2022. I don't believe they're allowed to test any 2022 stuff in the wind tunnel at the moment. I feel like that was announced when they pushed the regs back to kind of stop teams just chucking the next 2 years away and focusing on it. So again, I'm sure they'll be doing some sort of work behind the scenes, and they already have had some kind of work prepped for in the last couple of years. But it is a worrying situation. Personally, I think they're going to stay. But if someone was to come from the future and tell me that Renault weren't going to be in the sport after 2022 or 2023, I wouldn't be particularly shocked. So, yeah, that's just my thought. Obviously, there was the rumour as well that Ricciardo was leaving because he kind of caught wind of Renault possibly leaving the sport, and there's obviously there's been no confirmation to those rumours yet. I doubt there will be until a decision is made on Renault's future, but it does kind of make you think, and it does really make you worry. Daniel Ricciardo then, obviously he is leaving, going to McLaren for 2021. That leaves a spot open at Renault. Now they've said they're not going to pick a driver until the start of the season, and really you could link anyone in Formula 1 or Formula 2 or even outside of the current grid into that spot. I guess the first two names that people, I guess, want in the car are either Fernando Alonso or Sebastian Vettel, keeping him on the grid. If we start with those two for now, what are your opinions on those, and what the chances of them actually stepping up into that Renault car?
Yeah, those two are definitely the names on everyone's lips at the moment. To be honest, I was buying the Alonso story when it first broke, purely because there seemed to be a lot more media around it than I was expecting, because to be completely honest, my personal view on it is that it would be a little bit of a mistake for Renault to make, or to go back to having Alonso in the car. There's no doubt that he can probably still throw a race car around a track very fast, and for someone of his caliber coming back into Formula 1 after a bit of time away, I don't think he would be, I don't even think he would be the worst driver on the grid if he did come back. The thing that makes me think that they wouldn't want to do that is, it seems a little bit gimmicky to me to go back to him. I've used this reference before on a podcast with the F1 debate show boys. It reminds me a little bit of the South Park series where they're all eating member berries and harking back to sort of like the good old days. And I don't think it would be a very forward-thinking decision for Renault to go back to Alonso. I mean, the guy is a very good driver. And, you've got Kimi on the grid at 40 who can still, put in a show when he wants to. But for me, it would be more of a marketing exercise than something that's going to propel Renault forward. And when you think about the factors we've just touched on, are they going to stay in the sport? For me, you need to build around something that is a bit more project focused and a bit more long-term thinking than just, right, what's gonna get us a load of marketing money thrown at us, or what's going to be able to generate a load of revenue just in the first sort of year or so that Alonso is around. Because if he comes back, the hype and the immediacy of any returns that they'll get financially, to me, would wane significantly if they then don't give them a car that they can actually do something with. You saw the way that, no one forgets that Fernando Alonso won championships and that he was a great driver and that he's one of the best we've seen. And to some people, he's right up there with the conversation of some of the greatest. But watching him go around in that McLaren that was nowhere near the pace on anything was almost torturous. And I don't see him necessarily wanting to do that. I think he personally might want to come back for that sort of spike of activity and attention that they would definitely get. But for me, it would be the wrong move. I think more realistic in terms of what they could do would be take on someone like Vettel, who is coming straight out of a Ferrari setup. Think of the amount of knowledge and intel that he's going to have, having raced at Red Bull. I know obviously it's a different era and we're heading into different regs sort of imminently, but he was at Red Bull and won 4 world championships there. He's been racing with Ferrari since then, who've got a very quick car, a lot of straight line speed, a lot of the things that Renault team have struggled with themselves. So he could bring a lot more knowledge to that team, I think, and would be more valuable as an asset for a long-term program than Alonso would be. But again, I don't necessarily see it mainly for that main reason I just made then about Alonso and McLaren. does Vettel want to go and spend his next few years at Renault trundling around, sometimes fighting for the last point that's available on a Sunday? I don't think he does, and I just don't see Renault providing a car even to, Esteban and to Daniel this year, and that's going to get them higher up the grid. And someone like Sebastian Vettel, everything I know about him and the way that he presents himself is that he wouldn't want to spend 2, maybe 3 seasons, maybe just 1, trundling around at the back of the grid and having that be his final year. But you never know. Maybe there's a project role for someone like that. Maybe you start off as, you come and you're a driver for us for a year, and then you progress into something that's a bit more back-end focused as it relates to the race team and the way the car works and so on. So we'll see. I think those two are the names that people want more generally, mostly because no one wants Vettel to leave the sport at the minute. Everyone seems to feel like he's got more in the tank. And also because there's a lot of hardcore Alonso fans who would love to see him back, and it would be, for the short-term spectacle, I think it would be very interesting, but for Renault, not for me.
Yeah, I to be fair, I've got to agree with you. And there was, again, I'm going to go back to rumours, but back when he was dropped from Ferrari and there was, a little bit of talk, would he go to McLaren? And a rumour did surface that he was in talks with McLaren, but then rejected the offer that McLaren put on the table. Whether that's true or not, if Vettel isn't going to accept an offer from McLaren, who finished at least 4th and is going to Mercedes power units next year, I can't see him taking one from Renault. But the interesting point you made there was Renault needing someone who can, branch off their knowledge of a top team. And that's what Vettel could do, but it's also what someone like Valtteri Bottas could do. Now, this, of course, depends if Toto Wolff decides to not sign Bottas on for 2021. Again, there was a rumour that went out on Twitter saying that Wolff isn't even interested in talking to Bottas, which I don't personally believe. I think he did a good enough job last year and will probably do a good enough job this year to keep his seat for at least another year. But let's say Bottas was kicked out of Mercedes for whatever reason, whether they want to promote Russell or if they want to sign Vettel for a year, as brilliant but unlikely as that would be, could he fit into the Renault team?
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and I think there's a lot of moving parts that would have to happen for that move to become likely. And like you've said, there's been the rumours at the minute. I think it was just this morning that Aston Martin announced one of their first hires to help with their new program would be someone from Mercedes whose name I'm forgetting, but that could send the tumbling box going for someone like Vettel to get a year at Mercedes, which of course would mean Bottas leaving. It's an interesting one. I think you're spot on in terms of he is someone who could bring something to them as a team and be a really valuable asset to them. And he's shown from his Williams days as well that, Valtteri is no slouch. He has been, I say unfortunately, he's still got to drive the best car, but he's been stuck with Lewis Hamilton, which a lot of people struggle with in terms of being able to compete. And this is completely non-scientific and based on nothing, but he looks like a Renault driver in my head. He seems to fit the mould of someone who I could see sat in a Renault seat. But again, I don't know necessarily that him and Esteban, maybe actually when I think about it, when I say it out loud, maybe him and Esteban could have quite a good balance of, youth and experience, because even though Esteban is still young, he's got a lot of Grand Prix under his belt. And like you said there, Valtteri coming and bringing some of that knowledge from the Mercedes program could be very interesting. So yeah, as I think about it, and as you raise the point, that makes more sense perhaps than I was giving it credit for. So yeah, maybe that could be quite a good 1-2 combination actually.
You make a good point about the team dynamic as well. I think, Bottas and Ocon, I don't know who would be number one there. You could say, Ocon, because he's been with the team longer, and he's obviously French as well, which works quite well with the team. But then you've also got Bottas, who is a proven race winner and has been driving for Mercedes for the last few seasons. So I don't know whether I guess Bottas could see it as an opportunity of, it's my best spot on the grid, 2022. It's a bit of a lottery at the moment. You never know. I could end up in a race winning car. So I guess that's really why any seat on the grid at the moment is going to be quite hotly contested from more or less anyone that might find themselves without a seat at a current top team. Now, there's 2 other drivers in the current group which I've put down and I've not heard talked about. And there's a little bit out of left field. But Danny Kvyat and Pierre Gasly, obviously AlphaTauri's current drivers, but we know what Red Bull's junior system's like. It's incredibly ferocious, and even both of those drivers have been dropped in the past. Could we... And again, another thing to point out is they've currently got a very nice lineup in F2. You've got... and also Super Formula. Yuri Vips in Super Formula, Yuka Tsunoda and Jehan Daruvale in F2. Several drivers now that are only really one step away, only one good F2 season away from stepping up into perhaps an AlphaTauri seat, which means one or both of those drivers could go. Could they possibly find a lifeline at Renault? Is there... I guess Gasly's obviously French, which could work with them as well, having an all-French lineup, Ocon and Gasly. Obviously, though, Kvyat, he's scored several podiums in the past with Red Bull and Toro Rosso. Would he fit in that mould? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I actually did a video on what's next for Pierre Gasly because I've got a bit of a soft spot for him, and Renault was actually one of the places that I could see him ending up. And I agree with you in the sense that it's a bit of out of left field. It's a bit of a long shot option there. But when you look at that AlphaTauri seat, there is a hard ceiling at that team. They are, the only true junior team to another competing team on the grid, and I always find the team dynamic at a place like Toro Rosso, AlphaTauri must be crazy, because not only are you competing against your teammate because you want to beat them, you're competing with them because you can see that the next step is that car 10 grid spots down the grid on a race weekend. And you're right, they are ruthless with that junior program. They're ruthless with their seats. They're not afraid to play musical chairs. And for me, Kvyat is... I can see him being out of the sport by the time his next contract runs out. Whether that's... I'm not sure if that... I think that's the end of this season. It might be the end of next. I don't see Renault wanting to take... what would essentially be a bit of a gamble on him. He's proven that he can do it at this level, and like you said, picked up a few surprise podiums here and there. He also had that year testing with Ferrari, which I'm sure would help in terms of some of the things he's picked up. And the thing about Kvyat, actually, is that I always forget how young he is, because he looks sort of like a bit of an old bloke, but I think he's only 26, so he's got a bit of potential. But for me, purely for that French connection, as you touched on, I think someone like Gasly could find themselves in that space. The brand is very tied to the French people. It's part owned by the government, it's backed by the government as well. And I think the more that Renault sort of slowly start isolating themselves in the sense that they're not providing engines to other people, the more that it would make sense for them to almost become a national team, which sounds crazy when you think about, let's just pick people who are French, but Gasly did have a tough time in that Red Bull, but I think he's a very quick and very capable driver. I also think Esteban is a very quick and capable driver. His time in the sport before his break to test with Mercedes, he had a lot of points finishes in those 2 years in a car that was perhaps outperforming. He was perhaps outperforming the car, so I could see that as a potential. I think highly unlikely, purely, based on the same reasons you touched on, how volatile that AlphaTauri seat is. Renault themselves have a decent driver program, young driver program, and their sports academy is perhaps not as highly regarded at the moment as some of the others that are coming through. But you've got Zhou and you've got Lundgaard. I'm not sure what their super license point status is at the minute, but I think Zhou was the best performing rookie in F2 last year. Lundgaard has shown that he's quick. And again, going back to long-term or short-term thinking with someone like Renault, for me, it would make sense to keep Esteban as your sort of French lead driver and build around him and bring in someone like a Zhou or like a Lundgaard or someone else even potentially that could then partner him, as opposed to, like you mentioned there, you bring Bottas in, well, now we've got a 1-2 driver battle situation, which doesn't necessarily work for anyone. It didn't work for Ferrari this year, and you've seen that, teams who have a very solid 1-2 dynamic, it's very easy, or it seems easier for them to get success as a team, as opposed to having to worry about those internal conflicts and strategy talks and stuff like that. So yeah, potentially I'd say if it is going to happen, it would be Gasly over Danny, and just to keep the French connection.
Yeah, and great minds think alike. The next drivers I was going to mention were Lundgaard and Zhou. In terms of their super license points, I don't believe either of them are there yet, but if they can perform well enough in this F2 season, I think that's kind of why Renault are waiting as well. To not just, I guess, see how Ocon performs as well, because, we haven't actually seen Ocon race a car in now, I guess, a season and a half. So, for all we know, we could come on and he could be absolutely rubbish. we really just don't know. But Lundgaard and Zhou, definitely really good options. Although I think Zhou is the better option in terms of experience at the moment, it seems to be that Renault are leaning towards Lundgaard. Not 100% certain why, but there just seems to be some sort of favouritism there. The other driver that he's not part of Renault Academy anymore, but I wouldn't be surprised to see Renault going back to, might be Jack Aitken. He's obviously with Williams at the moment, and perhaps there's a seat open for him there. But, Aitken, he's a proven F2 race winner. I don't think he's the quickest driver on the F2 grid at the moment, but he's definitely capable, and he's, for one, very, very consistent. So, getting Aitken into that Renault seat, maybe trying to get him out of that Williams contract if Renault can, I think it would work quite well for both parties. The only other driver that I've actually got written down here, and it kind of feels like a stab in the dark, but I can also see it happening, is going back to Nico Hülkenberg. And again, that's a name that's been thrown about quite a lot. Obviously booted out of Renault at the end of last year for Ocon. But could we see Hulk make a return? I think everyone would love to see it, but is it really going to be feasible?
Yeah, I mean, I think it could make total sense, particularly for a little bit of a sort of stopgap whilst they figure things out, because as you just touched on there, and I've been thinking it myself, I've just been assuming that, Ocon's going to come in and be good, but, if he has a really poor season, they're going to probably have to start rethinking both their seats as well. And I think when you look at, there was loads of rumours when Vettel went that, someone like a Hulk to come in for a year at that Ferrari seat even, just while they figure things out heading into the year of the new regulations, was something that was getting floated around. I personally would have no qualms with them going back to Nico. I think he's a great guy. He's very well liked. I think, as you mentioned there, the people within the sport and the fans would love to see it, because I think the grid is a little bit less rich without him in it. And one of the things that's just been so frustrating for probably himself and his fans is just not being able to quite get to that level that everyone thought he would. But I was very surprised that he didn't end up somewhere else. This year, not that we've started it, but when it turned out that he was leaving, I thought it would make sense for him to stay in the sport, just because he's proven that he could do it, and he can do a job at a lot of different teams. And for me, it would not be surprising at all if they turned around and said, Nico, can you come back for, maybe it's just the year, maybe they just get through to the year of the new regs with him, and then, like you said, they assess where's Zhou, where's Lundgaard, where's someone like Aitken, because that's a good point you raise as well, because he's competing with Ticktum as well there at Williams, who they poached from Red Bull after his sort of dramas there too. So there's a lot of sort of talent that's knocking on the door that perhaps isn't quite ready to break through. And when you're in that situation, you need someone to come in and maybe just fill that seat for a year, just to help refining things and getting the car to where it needs to be before you then pop one of those young drivers in. So yeah, I think that one for me is probably more likely than some of the more marquee names that people would perhaps want to see. For me, it's more likely you would go back to Hülkenberg than sign Alonso, but you just never know. I mean, you literally never know with Formula One. Literally anything could happen. So it'll be interesting to see, but I would not begrudge them, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if Renault turned around and said our driver for 2021 is Nico Hülkenberg.
Okay, so I guess it's like a last point then, a bit of fun. If I had to ask you to pick one name out of either that list we talk about or any other driver on the grid that's good that you think will be at Renault in 2021, who's that going to be?
Let's see. I don't want to say Alonso because I don't want it to be true, but it could be. Without knowing any of the potential movers or shakers, I'm going to say that they will go back to Nico Hülkenberg.
Okay. I'm not going to be as radical as you're going to go. I'm going to go with Alonso. I think I want to stick to my guns, and I kind of want to see him back in the sport. I don't think he's given us all he has to offer. I think, as you said earlier, he can take a team. Like, go back to 2012, Ferrari, that car was a dog. It was awful, and yet he brought it into championship contention and very nearly won the championship in Brazil as well. So I just feel like Alonso would fit that team, again, as a bit of an interim option. Maybe into the new regs, so a year into the new regs. It really depends on how well he's doing, but Alonso, I still think he's got it, I still think that if you put him in a car, he's going to really take that team to new heights. And I think Renault, looking at the way they've taken Ricciardo leaving as well, and the way they've kind of reacted to it, I kind of think they now want to go and say, right, well, we haven't got Ricciardo, let's get a better driver in. And there's not many drivers on the grid that you could really rival with Ricciardo at the moment. Alonso or Vettel, I guess, but I think more Alonso because I think that would work for me, both parties. Vettel, again, I'm just not convinced it'll work for him. But Alonso, that might, be that little screw you from Renault to Ricciardo saying, oh, well, you've gone, look who we've replaced you with. But yeah, that's just my opinion. Was there any other thoughts that you wanted to add on at the end, Ollie?
No, but actually just picking up on that point you make there about the sort of screw you Daniel situation, it might not necessarily be that personal, but one interesting thing I think would be, it was reported how much money Renault were paying Daniel, and obviously when the budget caps come in, the I believe the driver salaries and marketing activities aren't included. It's all based on car performance and R&D and so on. And I think one thing that's going to be interesting to see what Renault do in the future is, do they say, right, here's X tens of millions that we were paying this driver, this is going to be budgeted for the next few years so that we can go out and make a marquee signing like an Alonso or like a Vettel or someone who's really big that you could potentially draw in with the cash? Or do they just throw it into the vault and say, look, there's a pandemic happening, we're worried about our future in the sport anyway, we need to save this money? Because I think that could make a big difference as well in terms of where they go with their next move. Is the Daniel Ricciardo money now free for Cyril to use in 2021 as a lure for a driver, or are they going to sort of button down the hatches? In which case, you're probably looking at one of those junior drivers stepping up who they can pay, a couple of $100,000 to, as opposed to, $20 million a year or whatever it might be. So it would be interesting. It wouldn't surprise me if as a bit of a reaction to what's happened, they just do go out there and get Alonso, and suddenly there's just Alonso merch everywhere on Renault.com.
Oh, I'd love that. I think it would be a fairy tale story. I think him coming back to where he won those championships. But Ollie, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure. Ollie's YouTube channel is TGSF1. I'll leave a link to that down in the description below. Make sure you drop a subscribe on that one as well. Absolute great guy, as you could probably tell. Ollie, do you want to talk a little bit about your channel now, whether you're on?
Yeah, definitely. So, TGSF1. It's a channel I set up just before COVID happened and all the races stopped, which was very frustrating. But it's a little bit of everything, really. It's mostly my thoughts and opinion on the news and what's happening, and hopefully some race reviews and previews, and also trying to do quite a lot of collabs with different content creators in the community, just having a bit of a chat and a bit of fun talking F1.
Yeah. Perfect. So like I said, make sure you do subscribe to that channel and pop them a follow on Twitter as well. I'll leave that in the description as well. Ollie, again, thank you so much for coming on. Been an absolute pleasure. Guys, in the comments below, I want you to tell me who you think will be signing for Renault in 2021. Will it be Alonso? Will it be Vettel? Will it be someone we haven't talked about? Let me know. We can probably start a debate down there. And like I said, if you want to get involved on an episode like this, let me know on Twitter or in the comments below as well. With that, it's all from me. Hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one.